What it do? Alf here with Tony, that's obviously unconscious. So a couple weeks ago I did Freecoaster 101 that you guys seem to enjoy quite a bit, and you had a lot more questions for me, and you really wanted to know the difference between cassettes and Freecoasters. So guess what we have today for your Tech Thursday? That's right, Freecoasters versus cassettes. So let's find out what makes each tick. See what I did there? Tick. We're witty. All right, before we get into the anatomy of a Freecoaster and a cassette, let me first explain some of the things that people really like or dislike about Freecoasters and cassettes. Adam LZ had a video a year ago that's really thorough and explains a lot of the differences, but it's mostly subjective to riding. I'm actually gonna cover more of the internal, the mechanics, and the mechanisms that kind of make each unique or different, and why people, lean towards one versus the other. Also, I should note, I'm not sponsored, endorsed, or compensated by any means by Primo BMX. Tip Plus is a distributor that we use a lot here at OSS, so I just wanted to use a hub that has both the Freecoaster, the Freemix, and the cassette, the Remix. And since Primo has both of those, I thought it'd be easy for this tutorial to just kind of show you the strengths, the similarities, and the weaknesses. All right, and for starters, you can see that usually a cassette hub is a lot skinnier and lighter than a Freecoaster. The reason for that is that the Freecoaster has to have room for the clutch, the driver, and the engagement mechanisms. So usually a cassette hub has one flange that's smaller and a taller flange, and usually the taller flange is where the driver and the engagement mechanism is all housed. So another difference is that this hub is actually female, so I'll be explaining what female versus male. And as you can see, the Freecoaster has a male axle, and the Remix in this case has the female option, which means that a bolt threads in as opposed to an axle that's basically the male version and the bolts thread onto the axle. Obviously, the most apparent difference is the noise. And the reason for the noise in the case of the Primo Remix is that there are 4 springs and 4 pawls on the inside of this hub, and they all engage. And basically it's like a ratchet system on the inside, and that's what you're hearing the noise. When they're decompressed, they will click, and when they're engaged, they won't make a noise because they're actually latching onto the hub and causing it to spin. So enough of the exterior differences. Let's take both of these apart and see what makes each unique. All right, so for starters, I'm gonna take apart the Freecoaster just like I did in the last tutorial, and then I'll take apart the cassette and we'll see what the differences are. First and foremost, remove the bolt, the spacer, and in this case, the hub guard. And you want to do that for both sides just to make it easier. On this hub, the bolts don't matter which side they correspond to, but the hub guards do. So on this Primo Freemix, it comes with a drive side hub guard. So as you can see, it's basically very similar to the non-drive side hub guard, except there's an opening for the chain. Okay, so now that we've removed the bolts, time to remove the lock nuts. So for this hub, we'll need a 6mm Allen and a 24mm wrench. To take this apart, you want to place the 24mm wrench on the drive side lock nut, place your 6mm Allen on the insert at the end of the axle, and then just break it loose. I've already done this, so it's going to be a lot easier than if it's brand new. It's going to be pretty tight. You might want to do it on the floor and you really use some leverage. Once you've broken it loose, then all you have to do is unthread it using your hands. And then once the lock nut is removed, as you can see, all you really have to do is kind of like tap the axle. And usually we recommend a rubber mallet or something with a rubber end. I'm gonna use this wrench that has a little rubber piece here. And just basically all you're doing is pushing the axle so that this bearing gets punched out. Kind of tap it out. Once the bearing pops off, then you're ready to remove the axle. So now that the axle is off, all you have to do is unthread the driver. That comes out easily. And lastly, we have the clutch mechanism. You can just push that out with your finger. It'll drop right out. And there you go. So let's take a closer look at all the individual components. All right, so basically the main components of this Freecoaster are the 2 axle bolts. These are 17mm. The 2 lock nuts. We have the drive side lock nut and the non-drive side. Then we have the clutch mechanism, the driver, the axle, the spacers that basically adjust the slack on your Freecoaster, and then the hub bearing. Inside of the driver, there's also a bearing or 2. This one has, I believe, 2 bearings. And then the bearing on the actual drive side that remains inside of the hub. We don't need to punch it out because it sits there, and if you damage this hub bearing, you just take apart all the pieces and then punch that out. Okay, so now that we got the Freecoaster, let's take a look at the cassette. All right, so once again, we have the Primo Remix And this is the Pro wheel, so it comes with the hub guards. So for this hub, you want to unthread the studs. So for this female cassette, we're actually going to have studs that are going to thread into the female piece. So these are the male component, this is the female piece. So the female axle still remains in the hub. So we're going to remove both studs from each side. And again, we have the non-drive side and the drive side hub guards. And now we have both studs out of the hub. And much like the Freecoaster, we're going to have to use a 24mm wrench to loosen up the lock nuts. Since this axle is actually female, there's not going to be an insert for the 6mm here. So the drive side is going to require a 25mm wrench and the non-drive side a 24. So I'm going to use a 24 on the non-drive side, and then I'm going to use a crescent wrench on the drive side just to break her loose. Okay, so once it breaks loose, again, you can do this by hand. And usually any lock nut that goes on the driver's side is always going to be more shallow than the one that goes on the non-drive side. The reason is that this is going to butt up against the drive side, and usually if you look at a hub, the drive side has a lot of room that's being taken up by the driver, and the non-drive side, since there's nothing there, it's just used as spacing. So this lock nut is usually longer to compensate for the drive side. So again, we've removed the lock nut from the driver's side, and then you're going to use something like the end of this wrench to tap the axle until the bearing comes out on the backing side, and voila, the axle comes apart. Once you've done that, then you can basically remove the driver and any spacers that go in there. Alright, so everything's been removed, so let's see what makes a cassette different from the Freecoaster. Okay, so the components that make up the cassette are, and in this case again, this is a female hub, so we have the female inner axle piece with 2 bearings on the non-drive side. Then we actually have the driver, which is different from the driver on the Freecoaster, and I'll explain why in a second. Then we have the 2 lock nuts, and again, the non-drive side is taller than the drive side, and on the cassette, the drive side lock nut actually goes into the hub, and on the driver side of the Freecoaster, it just sits outside of the hub. And then we have the 2 studs, and then we have the non-drive side and the drive side hub guards. Now let's see what is the main difference between the Freecoaster and its internals and the cassette and its internals. Again, so the main difference between the cassette and the Freecoaster is the internals on the actual hub. So on a cassette, you have this ring on the inside that has these grooves. And basically what's going to happen is that this driver has 4, and not every hub is the same, but the Primo one has 4 springs and 4 pawls. And basically what happens is that when you place this inside, it's going to act like a ratchet. So basically, this is a left-hand drive wheel, so when you're moving forward, it's going to engage. So this is, again, left hand, so moving forward is this way. When you're coasting or you're going backwards, then this will disengage, and all the clicks are basically all the different engagement points on the inner ring on the hub. And on the newer hubs, you can actually remove this ring, flip it, and then remove the pawls and springs on your driver, and this can become left hand or right hand. And again, this hub in particular has the 4 engagement points, and then I think there are 48 engagement points on the inside of the actual cassette. When you look at a Freecoaster, it doesn't have that. When you look on the inside of the drive side, it's just a bearing, and then the inside of the hub is actually going to have a lump. And what happens is, inside of this hub, we have this driver and this clutch mechanism, and as you can see, the driver threads into the clutch. And basically, the inside of the hub has a point where these grooves will attach to it, and that's what will cause the engagement or the driving force. When you free coast, you basically disengage the driver, and what's happening is that the clutch is moving further along on the inside of the hub, and it's no longer where that hump is, so it will not grab it, and that's what will allow it to coast. And again, as you can see the differences, the hub on the Freecoaster is a lot bigger because it has to make room for a lot more of the clutch and the driver. The cassette can be a lot smaller and sleeker because it only has to have the engagement point here. There's nothing on the inside of the hub that's actually going to engage. It's all in this mechanism and this ring right here. And then lastly, when you're putting this back together, basically what you have to do is place the driver and then reverse thread it. So if it's going to be a left-hand drive hub, you're going to turn it to the right so that the prongs become disengaged and then they can fit inside of the ratchet system. And as you can see, it's ratcheting along. Very important for the Primo, there's this little tiny spacer that goes on the inside of the driver right here. And as you can see, there's a bearing on the inside of the hub, and then this spacer will keep the spacing between the driver and that bearing, and then the bearings that are inside of this driver nicely spaced out. Alright, so let's put this hub back together. So again, this is going to be a female cassette, so what you have to do is place the axle and the two bearings back on the inside of the actual hub, and then using a little rubber mallet, or I'm using this little crescent wrench, and what you're doing is you're tapping the bearings in. Another thing you do is get a socket and tap the bearings in by putting the socket over the bearings and over the axle, and just making sure that the brim of the actual bearing is making contact with the actual socket. Usually you want to use a bearing press for this, but I'm doing these tutorials for people at home, so I know there isn't a luxury of having these at home. So I'll just do it with a little socket and basically just lightly tap it. It's nothing crazy. The bearings will just slide right in. And like I said, it's just a few little taps to make sure that the bearing is sitting nicely in there. Okay, so you want to make sure that there's no lip that's protruding outside of the hub flange. So basically, I have to tap it a little bit more. Okay, so the next thing you want to do is make sure that this bearing on the inside of the hub hasn't moved, and if it has, you kind of have to follow the same protocol. So if the bearing on the inside of the hub is actually moved, you can get a longer, shallower socket, put that over the axle, and just lightly tap it in. All you're really doing is making sure that the bearings are flush both on the inside of the hub and on the outside of the hub. So now they're both nice and flush. The next thing to do is remember to place this little spacer over the axle. It drops down and pushes up against the inner bearing. Then you drop the driver on top. Remember, you reverse thread it so that the prongs disengage. And then you're ready to put the lock nut on the driver's side. Okay, so this is now nice and tight. The next thing you're going to do is place, again, the taller non-drive side lock nut. And as you can see, this is going to have a side that has grooves on it, and then a side that's flush. You want the flush side to push up against the bearing, and you want this little groove side to be on the outside, because that's what's going to grab onto the inside of the dropout of your frame and not allow the wheel to shift when you're tightening it. Alright, so this thread's on, and now you can see there's some space, so you're going to have to tighten this up, again, using the 24mm wrench and the crescent wrench. So the 24mm wrench goes on the non-drive side, go on the other side, place your crescent wrench on the drive side, and then crank her down. If any of the bearings are actually not flush, then tightening this up will actually push the bearings into place. And you don't want to tighten it up way too much, you just want to make sure it's nice and snug. Lastly, when you tighten up these lock nuts, it'll push the bearing to where it has to be. So on this hub, the lock nut on the non-drive side will actually push the bearing in further into the hub. It'll back up on the inside of this hub, and which it has like a little stop. And then the drive side will do the same. It'll kind of like push the bushing that's on the inside of the driver, make sure everything's nice and centered. And then lastly, to test it, you just have to see if the driver can spin freely and it isn't too tight, and then the hub spins nice and smooth, which it does. And this drive side plastic hub guard will just kind of like push up onto that little lip, and then when you put it on the frame, it'll be nice and flush. Okay, so that pushes on there nicely. And then you want to place the non-drive side. As you can see as well, this lock nut has a lip that's a little taller. This kind of just clips on there. And then you're ready to put the studs and the washers back on. Again, the washer will have a smooth side that butts up against the back of the lug, and then the side that has grooves on it, you want it to face your dropout. So if the dropout of the frame goes here, then the knurling or the grooves will be butted up against that. And as you can see, there's this little piece of axle that protrudes, and that's actually going to go on the inside of the dropout. So the stud goes into this side, and you're all set. Okay, again, just give it a nice spin, make sure everything goes smoothly and it sounds nice, which it does, and she's ready to go back to the display. Lastly, let's put the Freecoaster back together, and then we'll cover some of the strengths and weaknesses of each. Alright, so we're going to put this back together. Again, make sure that the axle has grease both on the springs that are in the axle. So these are the spring pins. So you want to make sure there's grease both on the clutch and on the driver as well. First, you want to drop the clutch mechanism back into the hub, and that goes basically the groove side that kind of has like the mushroom tip will go downward into the actual drive side. So the back side will go up into the non-drive side. So that drops in. Then next, you drop your axle. So basically the spring pins will be on the left, and then the drive side will go down. Put the lock nut back on, thread it all the way to the bottom until it butts up against the actual bearing. And then you want to push it in or tap it in with a rubber mallet. You can use a hammer as long as you do it very lightly and you make sure you hit it nice and evenly so that it doesn't hit any of the threads on the outside. Okay, so once that's back on, the next part is to actually put the driver on, and basically that just threads in. This is a right-hand drive hub, so it threads reverse. Okay, nice and threaded. And then lastly, all you have to do is put the, again, lock nuts. The smooth surface always bumps up against the bearing or the driver. And then the groove side always is on the outside because you want that to bump up against the back of the frame. Alright, so for this hub, you can place the 6mm Allen on the axle insert. And then use this little crescent wrench to tighten her up. Again, you want that nice and snug. You don't want to over tighten it. Do that for both sides. Alright, she's snug. And lastly, the non-drive side hub guard goes over the lock nut, just clips on, and then you can place the drive side hub guard. Clips on as well. And as you can see, this has a slot opening for where the chain will go in. This doesn't have to have an opening since it's on the non-drive side. Alright, so now that we understand the anatomy of both the cassette and the Freecoaster, let's talk about why each one is better suited to what type of bike riding. So for starters, for the cassette, I'm prone to ride a cassette, and the reason for that is that I like pedal pressure. I don't use it as much to crank in the middle of a manual or bunny hop or anything like that, even though it is nice to have that there. The reason that I prefer cassette is that I do a lot of tail whips and tricks that involve like landing hard on the pedals, like crank flips, stuff like that. When I land, I don't want to have an extra amount of slack. Most people start off their BMXing with a cassette. Most complete bikes come with a cassette. Nowadays, there are complete bikes that come with the Freecoaster, and that's going to make it so a lot of kids don't really even know what direct engagement means. But basically, put it simply, when I land, I can instantly feel the engagement, and there's no dropping force. When you ride a Freecoaster, there has to be that slack because, again, you have to disengage the hub, and you have to allow it to not engage on that hump on the inside of the hub. So in order to do that properly, you have to have an area basically of wiggle room. And I don't like that wiggle room because there's nothing to engage. So when I do a tail whip, if I'm landing front foot forward and it's a little sloppy, I can feel the engagement. If you're on a Freecoaster, you won't feel that, and when you land, there will be nothing to engage. So basically, your force will drive you forward, and that will cause someone like me that's not used to it to basically hit my knee on the stem. And that's the reason that I don't really like it. And there's certain tricks that I need the responsiveness right then and there. So for instance, if there's a short runway to a rail, I like to know that I can basically have very minimal movement on my feet and I'll feel engagement. For a Freecoaster, you don't have that luxury unless you actually like engage the hub, backpedal, and then place your feet right when you know it's going to engage. One thing that Adam LZ covered in his review of Freecoasters versus cassettes that's really cool is that some people really think that because they haven't learned fakies yet, that you're going to get on a Freecoaster and it's going to be easier. Well, that's not true. When learning how to backpedal during a fakie, you're actually balancing and swaying back and forth. When you're learning fakies on a cassette and you're actually backpedaling, you're swaying your balance back and forth, and that actually allows you to balance better. When you're learning it on a Freecoaster, your feet are in place and you're basically kind of just like wiggling back and forth. So it's a little more difficult if you really think about it. A lot of people think that, oh, I 180 and then I instantly have to land and backpedal, so that's annoying. Well, it's always good to learn that way, and then once you have that pretty dialed and you go to a Freecoaster, then yeah, it's a lot easier. But until then, you want to learn your balance. So I do recommend learning fakies on a cassette first and then moving over to a Freecoaster, because then you don't have to worry about moving your pedals when you want to do a half cab or half cab bars or whips or anything like that. Same thing when doing like tricks to fakie. You're doing a 180 whip or 180 bar spin. Then it is convenient to have a Freecoaster because you can land kind of sloppy and have both feet on the crank arms, and you don't have to worry about backpedaling. When I do a 180 whip or 180 bar or anything like that, I have to make sure my feet stay in position properly, or obviously on a 180 tail whip, I have to make sure I catch the pedals perfectly and then I can backpedal. Or else, if I don't catch the pedals right, both my feet will be locked and then the cassette will engage and flip me on my back. So for that trick, fakie front flips, you also want to use a Freecoaster because you don't have to worry about like having your feet in the right position when you can actually lunge forward and do a fakie front flip. I haven't done one of those in a while. But, you know, I've seen Mark Webb recently do one on a cassette, which is insane. People with Freecoasters, keep in mind that this mechanism is a little different from a cassette A cassette is basically bomb-proof. It's been basically all the wrinkles have been ironed out and it sustains a lot of damage. A free coaster has some issues because of the movement that happens when you're actually free coasting. So the problem a lot of people had back in the day with free coasters was the actual bearings on the inside of the driver and the bearings inside of the hub would blow up. The reason for that is that when you're disengaged, there was actually like more lateral pressures, like side-to-side pressure, that will blow up the bearing. Basically, when it disengaged, the actual internals of the free coaster were just kind of like floating, and that means that there was less contact points for the hub, and it would cause like a lot of issues and explode. Nowadays, it's been resolved, but a free coaster needs a lot more maintenance than a cassette. A cassette, every once in a while, you have to take apart, clean it up, make sure there's no dust or dirt in there, and just add a little bit of grease or oil to the actual like prongs and springs. A free coaster, you need to make sure there's plenty of grease, make sure that there's no like metal shavings or particles inside of your hub that can cause issues. So on that sense, it requires more maintenance and you have to be more careful because, like I said, these are more partial to blowing up. This hub right here, the Primo Freemix, is actually one of the better selling hubs and the one that we have the least amount of like warranty issues here at the shop. So I definitely recommend this hub as well as the Primo Remix. And again, I'm not being paid to say this. This is just from proof from tons and tons of customers buying these hubs and never bringing them back. So again, free coaster versus cassette. If you like riding trails, if you like riding skate parks, if you like going fast, if you don't really go Fakie a lot, and if you want something that's really, really reliable, then you want a cassette. As for the free coaster, if you like going Fakie a lot, if you don't mind slack, or you don't need pedal pressure, and if you're riding a lot of street, or doing like really, really technical ramp riding, and you like to be silent, this is basically like a Prius versus like a really loud hub at the skate park, then you want free coaster. As far as like durability, it all depends on like your type of riding and how much maintenance and caution you take with each hub, but these should last you quite a bit of time. Honestly, the majority of the wheels get blown up because of grinding. People don't have hub guards and you damage your hub bearings, you damage the hub itself, the flanges, whatever, and that'll cause issues. But with maintenance, both of these are pretty bomb-proof nowadays. So basically, choose your poison. Now you've been better informed, so you can make a conscientious decision when making a purchase. Choose what suits your riding. Don't let your friends tell you, oh, free coaster is the way or a cassette's the way. Whatever you think will be more comfortable towards you and your riding, then go for that. That's gonna do it for me today. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Like always, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Leave any questions in the comment section or argue amongst yourselves in the comment section. I enjoy reading some good arguments in there. And as always, tune in for tomorrow's vlog. This has been Alfredo. Hope you guys enjoy this and have a nice rest of your weekend. Peace.